individuals that we have served here today with us, who's going to guide us through this morning. Kara Murray-Badal. Kara first came to the Mosaic Project as a youth leader when she was in high school. And she's since served in nearly every role in the organization, from an office intern to outdoor project staff to our administrative and outreach director, and now she's on our board of directors. And she's also an MBA candidate at the Wharton School of Business and an MPA candidate at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And Kara and I are both extremely excited and so honored to be joined today by Dr. Crystal Fleming. Dr. Fleming is a professor of sociology and Africana studies at SUNY Stony Brook, and she is the author of the critically acclaimed book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, on racism, white supremacy, and the racial divide. And we're so excited that she is currently working on a new book, Rise Up, which focuses on a subject that is the most near and dear to our hearts at the Mosaic Project, empowering youth to join the fight for racial justice. So thank you so much, Kara and Dr. Fleming. I am going to turn it over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Laura, for that lovely introduction. And I'm beyond excited. I've been excited this whole week to have this conversation with Dr. Crystal Fleming. So thank you for being here, Dr. Fleming.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to engage with you and the whole Mosaic community.
Woo! We're going to try and have a good time. Like, I know everyone is having a bit of Zoom fatigue right now. We've been on a lot of meetings, but like, I'm here for a good time, not a long time. So I'm really excited to get to chat with you and hopefully bring in lots of voices as well. I would love to start with just the fact that, like, you know, we work with people of all different ages, a lot of young people, but you are also an educator. And we had the opportunity before this to talk just a little bit about compassion. And I really thought your thoughts about compassion were beautiful. And I would love, if you don't mind, just sharing with everyone, what do you think the role of compassion is for you in making change and talking about race in particular?
Compassion is a huge part of not just what I do, but how I do it. And I love the opportunity to chat about that with you, because I don't know that might be obvious from, say, the title of my book or, you know, or the persona I may have on social media. But compassion is hugely important, but I also think it's a very delicate conversation to have when it comes to oppression, because people of color, people who've been marginalized historically, are often placed in the position of being expected to place the feelings and emotions and comfort of people in positions of power over their own. And so one of the things I love about Mosaic is that you equip young people with tools of assertiveness, right? So that, and also a critical thinking about power, which is so essential. But compassion. So spirituality is a big part of my life. And I think not just compassion for others, but also self-compassion is key for me. So one of the things I do in How to Be Less Stupid About Race is share and try to be somewhat vulnerable, which I know is something that you've written about, the role of vulnerability and talking about race and racism, but try to share my own journey to learning about these issues, learning about white supremacy and about anti-Blackness and settler colonialism and these real pillars of racial oppression in our society. Because I didn't grow up, you know, with this knowledge. I had to discover it. And I always start my classes or, you know, my talks with various groups and communities sharing that journey, because people assume Black professor, Black woman, like I came out of the womb with a Black power fist, quoting Angela Davis. And I regret to say that is not what happened. But self-compassion.
Quoting Angela Davis.
Yeah, maybe next time around. But self-compassion is part of what allows for me to reveal those moments of embarrassment or those turning points where I realized aspects of my own ignorance or blind spots. And listen, that work is ongoing, even for a scholar of racism, even for, you know, people who work on these issues in the community. We're hopefully always trying to deepen our understanding and deepen our compassion for each other and ourselves. You know, the thing about racism, one of the things about racism is that it's inherently dehumanizing. And so, of course, it socializes and teaches people not just to withhold compassion from others, but to actively express, kind of hostility, to enact violence, to become numb to that violence, right? And so, anti-racism has this emotional aspect, but also the inner work. For me, it's I think of it as spiritual, but you don't have to think of it as spiritual, but it's inner work, right? It's inner work of building a recognition of our interconnection with others, and building not just a respect, but an acknowledgement of our dignity as living beings. And I think it's even important to broaden that, not just for respect for other humans and human dignity, but the dignity of life and living beings, and recognizing our interconnection with all of life, because that's the only way we have a future on this planet, right? So yeah, that's a bit about compassion for me. And I think compassion can look differently in different contexts and articulate it from, different perspectives and positionalities. So sometimes a compassionate response can feel like a slap in the face, because sometimes correction, assertive correction is needed in the moment, and it might not feel good. It might not feel good to get called out if you've engaged in behavior or expressed an idea or feeling that reinforces racism. And so someone correcting you might not feel like compassion. Uh, and anyway, so this is just a bit of how I connect to themes of compassion and empathy, and also equipping people to understand that, particularly for racially marginalized people, I think, the teaching around compassion, or the approach to compassion, really needs to have this recognition of power, and power differentials, and the fact that I think for a lot of people of color, what we need to do first is to develop, and not develop, but to really stand in our power of centering compassion for ourselves and our own communities, and to build that self-compassion, to build from that, to spill out into the world, and to share that empathy with others. But that's my approach. I feel like, as a Black queer woman, I have to start with loving myself. And because I have been socialized in this society, as we all have, if you've grown up here, if you've spent enough time here, you've been socialized to have more compassion for white men than for anyone else. And sort of a cultural, even social psychological way, we build our society around the comfort and the centrality of people who are positioned to be advantaged by white supremacy and patriarchy. So yeah, that's that's how I connect with compassion and empathy.
Yeah, I resonate with that so much. At Mosaic, like, one of the first things that we teach the kids are our 3 keys to peace: jingle, jingle, baby. And they're listening, empathy, and assertiveness. And I think what you're talking about kind of lives like in the intersection of that space, because it's, obviously listening it's working to understand and hear other perspectives, but and empathy is feeling those other perspectives, and assertiveness is being strong without being mean. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about, where it's like, if we have empathy, we can feel for anyone. That's a practice that we take on for ourselves. That doesn't mean that we let people hurt us or take over our space. I've heard this question of like, is it like the sun? Is it meant to like shine down upon all of us? Or is it like a flashlight that we shine on ourselves and on the people we care about and we love? And I think I'm more of the mind that it's like the sun, that everyone can have it, but I also can't let you sit on my shoulders and take all my sunlight away. And I think that's where assertiveness comes in, that you create that space when you need to, and that you acknowledge that. The part that's hard, when you're working with young people, that you have to think about is, like, what are the systems of oppression already in place, and whose voice gets heard more, which is something we talk about with our kids, whose voice gets heard more, and who gets more, and whose feelings are heard more. And so I totally resonate with that. But there was another
boundaries too, right? Boundaries is another term that sometimes gets used in this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, we often talk about it like the space in a bubble, where it's like, I have this beautiful golden glowing bubble around me, and it's like, I can reach out to you from this bubble, but you cannot come into my little shiny bubble like unless I invite you into it, and I can create that space. So it's like, I can reach out to you, I can empathize with you, and again, you're taking care of yourself. And I think that especially to your point, like as a Black woman, also taking care of yourself is paramount to continue doing this work. I think anyone who's in this work has to keep, refreshing and figuring out how to take care of themselves. And that's.
Yeah, no, I had another thought, but I'm gonna let you keep talking. We're gonna come back to some of this later. I know we want to cover a lot of ground. This is just such an interesting discussion.
I have a million questions, but you said something that set me off. Actually, you were saying that we're trying to get better, but there's still ways in which we kind of are missing the mark. And so, I mean, I think the thing I loved about your book is you had such there are some things where I'd already heard this history, but the way that you talked about it or thought about it was a kind of a nuanced, different perspective, or gave me more depth. And so I wonder, like after this summer where we've had, I think a lot of people really investigating and thinking about themselves, but maybe still not quite getting where they need to go. I mean, also it's a journey, so there's never a destination, but still working on their journeys. I'm curious, like, what are the things that you think are still missing in a lot of the conversations that we're having now about race, or the histories that are missing to help people understand what's really going on?
I feel like one of the challenges we have in our society that's hyper connected and 24 hours social media and everything is that we're and it's not necessarily all bad, but I think we're in this constant mode of analysis and critique, and not so much recognition that sometimes we have to hold space and kind of cut off that analysis and just witness and wait to kind of assess what's going on. I feel like this year, which by the way, we still have almost the whole month of December to get through. We don't even know what lies between us and January 1st, 2021. But, so much has been happening. And I frankly feel like I will not be able to fully, maybe ever fully process, but really take stock until we get through it a bit more. So, I mean, what's missing from the conversation? Partly, I feel like we need to also acknowledge that the conversation, before we look at what's missing, the conversation and collective action have both shifted in really, really powerful ways this year. And of course, this year is just building on, long movements, intergenerational movements for racial justice, and positive change. And I think the fact that, and it, for those of you who are new to my work, or if you've not yet read How to Be Less Stupid About Race, I kind of start off the book with these intro chapters about critical race theory, which became a buzzword kind of again this year. I get into intersectionality. There's a chapter called Listen to Black Women. And in the middle, there are kind of these sandwich. Say what?
I love that chapter.
Thank you. I enjoyed writing that chapter. But it's sandwiched in between the beginning and the end of the book are these very politically focused chapters. So there's one on racial stupidity in the Obama era, and then Trump. And so in the middle, I really get into politics. And this year, we've had all kinds of discourse around from our former President Barack Obama, coming out against the idea of defunding police, right? Critique of progressives and abolitionists. But I think what's so exciting is that abolitionists have put those words in the mouths of some of the most powerful people in the country. Even if they're critiquing it, they have shifted the discourse. And I'm learning from abolitionists. Mariam Kaba is someone I learn from all the time. But there are more and more abolitionist organizers who have been working for decades on police violence, on the carceral state, on white supremacy, and how it is articulated with practices of violence that accrue particularly against racially marginalized people. And this year, I think, was really a turning point in bringing out these activist discourses and practices into the public sphere. And I think, before we think about what's missing, I just want to acknowledge that happened. It's still happening. And I think that's so powerful. And it's something I'm deeply grateful to abolitionists for. even as I, very much continue my learning journey and learning more about abolition. But yeah, I mean, I think change is glacial sometimes. Sometimes there are, these turning points in history where in the blink of an eye, it seems that everything has shifted. But, humanity as a species, we've been around for a couple of 100,000 years. Okay. And this is where we still are as a species. Okay. We have a long way to go, but also we have a long history behind us. And I think for those of us who care about building a better future, building a better world, building a way of relating to each other that is sustainable, that's built on compassion and a recognition of our interconnectedness, we also have to acknowledge that this is a very, 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 very long process, and we're part of it, and we need to find ways to sustain our hope. I mentioned Miriam Kaba. She is widely quoted as saying that hope is a discipline. Sometimes we can feel overwhelmed by the enormity of all that we'd like to change and all of the suffering and oppression that we witness. I certainly feel that way quite often. But we also have to acknowledge that we do create change at our micro level and even the social level on an everyday basis. Those of us who are connecting with groups like yours, working on the ground, working in whatever field we're in, we are creating positive change, and we have to focus on that, but also understand again that we're in it for the long haul. So I know there have been some already think pieces, and I understand the impulse, but there've been already a lot of sort of hand wringing over what happened to that huge outpouring of attention to racial justice and all the anti-racism books, right? And a lot of understandable cynicism about what that meant, that sort of maybe blip on the radar and the attention span of millions of people who finally figured out that they should learn about race and racism, maybe probably for the first time. And I understand the cynicism, but I also want to really hold space for acknowledging the possibilities that open up when we, even by a little bit, increase the margin of people, right? That sort of critical margin of people who understand that we have a significant problem with racism, understand that we have a lot to learn, and begin to understand that we have to make a lifelong commitment. We don't have to get everybody on board, but we have to increase the folks, even if we're in the minority, we have to increase the conscious and critical awareness of people on the ground, and understanding that it doesn't take everybody, because every social movement that has been transformative, whether we're talking about civil rights or the Haitian Revolution, whatever we're talking about, it didn't begin with everybody getting on board. It was a critical mass. And that's what our work is about, building that critical mass. So it doesn't really bother me if of the, I don't know, 5, 10, 20 million people bought books this summer, and even if 90% of them went back to living their lives as they were, that 10% matters. That 10% matters. And so our work is to try to still harness that possibility and to encourage people to continue this work for the long haul.
Yeah, definitely. I think, for some people who've been doing this work for a long time, it's kind of we've been here this whole time and now you're here. But I think
welcome. Yeah.
I think for a lot of us, it's like, come on in, the water's fine here in racial justice land.
Right.
I mean, and I always say, I don't think people understand just how amazing it is to really embrace diversity and embrace different cultures and embrace the reality of the world, essentially. I have my pleasure of having a diverse friend group. I go to quinces and bat mitzvahs, and we have real conversations, and I feel like I'm learning about the world as opposed to what happens if you're not really, taking that in. And right now, it's like when the Warriors first won a championship, and even the lady at the post office would be like, "Go Debs!" I feel like there's just people now out in my regular world that are thinking about these issues. And to me, that's exciting, and I'm excited that Mosaic's getting one more MCP trainings, more consulting trainings, because people are like, "Oh, we should have been doing this a long time ago," and now we're doing it.
Right, and I think culture. What we're part of what we're doing is building a culture of, you could call it anti-racism, but a culture that can counter the centuries of socialization and the centuries of culturally embedded white supremacy that we're all still living with. And so I think, again, I understand the cynicism about, performative wokeness and, how much change are we really making? And, but at the same time, listen, for generations, people were socialized, explicitly socialized and taught to believe that if you're white, then you are genetically, biologically, culturally, morally superior to everybody else. And, Martin Luther King Jr., most of his hard hitting and radical work, right, is not what's remembered in the Disney version of King that we usually get. But Dr. King understood that white supremacy was culturally embedded in the fabric of the United States. He wrote that it was, taught in schools and preached from nearly every textbook, and that it became part, of sort of the culture of the country, white supremacy as part of the culture of this country. And I don't think people usually who are new to thinking about race and racism, I don't think that there's really a deep appreciation for how deep that rabbit hole goes and how deeply embedded white supremacy is in our culture. So what that means on the flip side is that when we're building a culture of anti-racism, that's what we're up against. And so we have to count every single advance, every moment of progress, every person who's new to the barbecue. Come on to the barbecue, okay? Because we need you, and we need you to bring other people to the barbecue and understand that the pace of the change can be quite demoralizing at times, but we have to recognize the progress that we have made. And I think for me, that has been maybe the hardest thing to do, to be very honest with you. The more I learned about the history, the ongoing history of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, the more I felt frustrated with people who wanted to say, look how far we've come, because that's the discourse that gets privileged when it comes to matters of race. We've come so far, things are so much better. And so I think I kind of went to the other extreme, which was to, but for I think good reasons, to really kind of focus on all that has not changed. Because listen, we still live in a society that systematically dehumanizes people on the basis of these made up ideas of race, right? And that, I don't feel good celebrating, the fact that it's now illegal to, put me in chains, as long as, that's the thing within the carceral system, we know slavery is still legal, right? So we don't even have the full abolition of slavery in this country, right? Yet and still, activists, organizers, including young people, right, over the course of generations have also been a part of pushing against these systems of oppression and creating the possibilities that we are living in now, right? And I think that for me is that dance of despair and hope and that discipline that Mariame Kaba calls for. It's a discipline because we have to remind ourselves, yes, we are still dealing and grappling with, horrific forms of violence and inequality and injustice. And yet we're also still part of an intergenerational movement to build a better world. And that work matters. And if that work hadn't happened, many of us would not be here at all, much less in the positions that we are to create change and enact change. So that's the dance of hope and that discipline that I think is really essential to also teach young people who are coming to do anti-racist work.
Yeah. Ooh, give me chills. It's funny, but what you're talking about, there's a song, a Mosaic song that's like, the lyrics are sad and grumpy, down in the dumpy, hugly, snuggly, mean and ugly, sloppy, slappy, happy, happy, change and change and change. And it's just like all about the feelings you experience.
All the feelings.
And I think that song more than probably any other, because it's, in this work, that's what it is. It's like moments of joy and moments of pain. And it's like, you have to take in all of those feelings and figure it out. And I think, we're in a really unique moment. I heard from another really smart Black woman, a doctor recently, that we're in a syndemic. Like, people have been talking about the twin pandemics of like racial injustice and coronavirus, but she was talking about how these things actually build on top of each other and create, elevated problems in lots of communities of color. But we're still doing the work, and we're still finding joy in the work, and we're still, giving thanks to the people who put it together for us, to ourselves. I want to say there's a ton of questions in the chat, and I just want to let people know I'm seeing them and we will get to them. I'm not ignoring you, but I'm just going to take my 2 minutes in the sun and then we'll get to your questions. But I wanted to ask you a little bit about building community. I mean, because I think a lot of what Mosaic does is, try to, especially at our outdoor program, we try to create little microcosms of the world that we want to see. And that's like what it's about, is bringing kids together from different backgrounds. But, I know that you work with older students, and I wonder because we're talking about rising up for racial justice, and, a lot of the folks on this call work with children. So for children, like the young people who you're seeing and working with, how do you try to create the world that you want to see, or how do they try to create the world that they want to see?
Thank you for that question. So I teach at Stony Brook University, which is far away from Mosaic, on the other side of the country in New York on Long Island. And one of the things I love about Stony Brook is that it's a majority minority student body. And so, and more than that, it's incredibly diverse, like hundreds, my students speak over 100 languages. They're from everywhere. And even if they're from here, they have parents or friends and family members who, come from just extraordinarily international and diverse backgrounds. And what I try to do in my classroom, physically, before COVID-19 and now virtually, but I try to create this kind of space of possibility and vulnerability. And I don't call it a safe space, because I think that would be dishonest, for those of us who are cognizant of the ever presence of power and forms of inequality and so on. But I do try to create a space where we can acknowledge the discomfort of this topic, a topic that, is really about facing the violence that is enacted upon Black people, Indigenous people, and people of color. But a space where we can acknowledge that discomfort and also lean into it with tools of mindfulness and self-compassion and compassion for others as well. And understand that if we want to build a better world, we have to be willing to get uncomfortable, but we also have to be willing to create an opportunity for dialogue across difference. And so one of the things I love about the student feedback I've gotten over the years is that, I have, for example, African-American students who come into the class. I'm thinking of a particular class I teach on racism and ethnic relations. So they may come in with a lot of knowledge about anti-Blackness from their own lives, from other classes they've taken, from their own reading and edification. And yet they may not know very much about settler colonialism or the ongoing oppression of Indigenous people. They may not know a lot about the history of xenophobia and the fact that for most of our country's history, Asian Americans have been racially denigrated. And I think there's been a greater awareness of the ongoing nature of that due to the ways in which Asian people have been stigmatized and targeted by our current president and others. Hate, examples of attacks, physical violence against Asian Americans this year, sometimes enacted by other people of color. And so all this to say, I've had students of every background, convey how much they learned about other group struggles that they were not familiar with, and having that learning build hopefully solidarity across difference, but first awareness. The other thing I'd say about the space of possibility and what I try to do to attune students to the potential for creating change. It took me a few years to include this in my pedagogy, but some years ago I decided that after a semester of learning about oppression, my students we all needed to end that semester with hope and concrete practical ideas for change, and also imagination, right? So I began years ago to have as a final project, my students write a paper, but really it was a creative project where they would, figure out what aspect of race or specifically racism they wanted to change and focus on, and select whether it was an artistic project or coming up with a plan for an NGO, or coming up with some kind of educational intervention, but something that was meaningful to them, something that was reflective of their own experience, their own knowledge and passions, that would include a concrete plan for change and leave them with the possibility that this could be something they actually do. And some of my students have gone on to use their final project to inspire their future careers or community work, which is extraordinary. So I think that's what, in the new book, Rise Up, and, as I speak to educators and young people, that's what's so important to me. Bringing the knowledge that I try to convey about the history and sociology of racism into dialogue with the space of possibility, the need to not just imagine what we can do, but first imagine the kind of society, the kind of world we want to live in, and use that to inspire and lead us into thinking about what we can do to get there, right? We have to have a vision of possibility that is beyond the limitations of the world we live in right now. And that's what I love about learning from abolitionists, is that imaginative work of imagining otherwise, even if it seems impossible. And I had the chance to hear Angela Davis speak a few times in my life. A few years ago, it was outside of Paris. Well, that's another side of my work. My first book was about racial oppression and the legacies of slavery in France. My first book was called Resurrecting Slavery. So I, still go to France and work on racism in Europe. Anyway, Angela Davis was speaking with a group of community activists, and she said, one thing she said, and she was talking about abolition, but she said, even if it seems impossible, demandez l'impossible, demandez l'impossible. And that means in French, ask for the impossible. And that's what I want young people to do as well. Even if they tell you, we can't change this, we can't do that, or Black people and Indigenous people and other marginalized people have been overcoming the odds and creating the impossible for as long as our ancestors existed. This is what has brought us to where we are, the capacity to expand beyond limited beliefs and limitations imposed upon us, even if it's hard. And we need to encourage young people to spend some time in that space of possibility and imagination.
Ooh, I love that. And I'm trying to get in that space. That's good stuff.
I'm get there too. I'm trying. It's a daily practice.
Practice.
Yeah.
But I think that's a perfect place. So we're gonna do a switch over and go to Q&A. This is like a nice one to start with because it's a very technical question, and I think it's nice also because we're at different places. And so the question is just about what is modern day abolition? Like, what do you consider modern day abolition? How do you define that?
Well, I'm still learning about abolition and how to be less stupid about race in the last chapter, which is really about the possibilities for change. I do recommend some abolitionists to begin reading and learning from, because I'm doing the same thing. So I'm not the expert on abolition. I think you should go listen to people like Angela Davis and Mariam Kaba. And, there's, great books that, in addition to the anti-racism reading list, there were also abolition reading lists that have been circulating. Alex Vital's The End of Policing is one book that a lot of people are talking about. Next year, Angela Davis and Beth Ritchie and some others have a book coming out, I believe, called Abolition Feminism Now, which is going to be must read. There's Invisible No More, a book that came out a few years ago that's also really about the intersection of violence against Black women and femmes and the need for abolishing the carceral state. But for me, what I'm learning about what modern abolition means is going back to that theme that we were talking about towards the end of our discussion, Kara, that it's not just about, moving beyond reform and defunding. That's part of it, but it's also about changing what we think is possible for the way that we organize our society and relate to each other, and finding ways to move beyond violence, right? Which is such a huge core of Mosaic's teaching. Sort of recognizing the ways in which whether it's the prison industrial complex or policing or, you know, our legal institutions, and we could broaden it out, that lens to even, you know, acknowledge settler colonialism, which for me is really the root of what our country is built on. But that these systems are violent, and that if we want to build a society that's based on empathy and compassion and respect and interconnectedness, then we have to try to imagine otherwise. And we also have to understand that these institutions have histories. Policing did not always exist in the way that it does now. Modern policing is just that, new, it's modern. And we can look to other ways of being. We can look to indigenous communities. We can look to other alternatives for ways of thinking about addressing violence, rather than jumping to what we have been socialized to think of as normal, which is, you know, arresting, policing, incarcerating, and punishment, right, as really what a lot of these practices are about, enacting harm and punishment in violent ways. And how can we, whether it's through you know, transformative justice approaches or restorative justice approaches, but how can we grapple with violence? And you know, Angela Davis and others even ask, how can we end violence? You know, I don't know that I am as optimistic as those who think it's possible to end human violence, but I think we better try. I think we better try, because our future depends on that you know, sort of radical imagination and capacity for imagining change.
Yeah, I'm with you. I have lots of thoughts, but I'm going to power through these questions and not give them, because I know there's a lot of people who want to hear your thoughts. Someone asked about Isabel Wilkerson and your thoughts about caste system. I think I don't want to butcher Isabel Wilkerson's work, but essentially that her theory is that talking about race and racism is not enough, that it's truly a caste system that delineates in really specific, distinct ways that are similar to caste systems that we know across other parts of the world as well. So so someone was curious what your thoughts are about that as a framework about caste.
Well, you know, I have long admired Isabel Wilkerson's work. I haven't read Caste yet. It's one of the probably 50 books on my shelf that I've gotten recently that I need to read. But I think, and so I'm a sociologist, so Oliver Cromwell Cox is was a well-known Black sociologist, not trailbreaking, but, really was on the forefront of theorizing the relationship between race, racial oppression, and caste. I'm not sure what Isabel Wilkerson makes of his work, but I think he was one of the first to think about caste and race. Another scholar who, you know, was really on the forefront, trailblazing, thinking about caste and race, was W.B. Du Bois, who had a very great interest in the color line globally, and you know, sort of status hierarchies and so on. So all that to say, yeah, I'm sorry, I haven't read Caste yet, but I do think that, you know, aside from the specific, you know, example of caste, we have to understand that racial oppression is part of a longer history of status oppression, and that it's sort of, you know, thinking about the possibilities of ending racialized, you know, categories and ideologies, one thing, but how do we grapple with status hierarchy more fundamentally, and the need for many people to feel better than others, and the ways in which these status differentials come to signify human worth. This is also something, pardon me, in the end of How to Be Less Stupid About Race, that I bring in Octavia Butler, who I love, but Octavia Butler's work in thinking through the difficulty of freeing ourselves from our belief in, you know, and reliance on status difference that signals human worth, and how do we get beyond that thinking? And I think caste is part of that conversation. I have heard some suggest, and paraphrasing the new book, that, maybe we need to stop talking about racism and only talk about caste. I mean, I don't know. I'd have to read the book to see if Wilkerson makes that argument. I think that, it is important to educate people about what racism means. And if caste is part of that conversation, great. But I don't think that the word or the term or, the concept of racism is going anywhere anytime soon. And so we need to acknowledge it, educate people about it, and fight it.
Amazing. There's a few questions about kind of specific groups, and I'm gonna ask them all together because we just don't have a lot of time, even though each question is beautifully crafted, and I wish I could ask them exactly as they were written. But there's some questions about essentially how do we talk about economic empowerment, how do we talk about immigrant rights, and how do we talk about about disability and the rights of the differently abled community. And I think if you don't mind answering those kind of broadly about what are the, in each of these communities, or kind of broadly, how do we bring in the intersectionality in these conversations?
Well, that's exactly it. Intersectionality is the framework that I think is essential for thinking through the intersections of and the sort of mutual imbrication of systems of power and axes of difference. So, that chapter I mentioned in How to Be Less Stupid About Race, Listen to Black Women, that was really a chapter about intersectionality and Black feminist thought, because Black women, and also women of color, have been on the forefront of saying we don't need to just talk about class or race, or talk about gender on the one hand and sexuality or race, and that we need to actually have a holistic understanding of power that also builds solidarities across our differences without pretending as though those differences do not exist. And so I think the conversation about racial justice absolutely has to be in dialogue with the conversation around disability justice, around class oppression, and all forms of oppression. And lastly, I would say, this is something I was thinking of just this week. There's been a lot of talk about the protests for racial justice, the resurgence of Black Lives Matter this year. I have to say, as we get into, I don't know, what is this, month 9 or so of this pandemic, and in our country, right, the economic despair that has been particularly acute among communities of color, but not only. I think I have been perplexed about where the economic justice protests are. How is it that we don't see, the same? And this is for students of the United States and our society. This is not a new question, right? Why don't we see more people protest and stand up around economic justice? And I think what I would love to see is, more of a effort to draw critical connections between racial justice and economic justice. And I think if we look at folks like W.B. Du Bois, who I mentioned earlier, one of the main, contributions he made in his work was to explain very clearly that the people who benefit from white supremacy the most are white elites, right? The owners of capital, and that it is through sort of the co-option of working class and poor whites into white supremacist ideology that they're sort of socialized to see fewer similarities between themselves and Black and brown people who are poor and working class than they see between themselves and white elites. And Du Bois called this the wages, the psychological wages of whiteness, that you're sort of taught to feel that you're better than these Black and brown inferior people. And then you get co-opted into the system that economically oppresses you as well. And we have folks like Jonathan Metzl, whose book Dying of Whiteness came out not too long ago, which is, drawing those critical connections. So we need to continue to do that, because white supremacy doesn't work out too well for poor white people, truth be told. Of course, it works out even worse for poor Black people and poor Indigenous people. But we need to understand that the fight for justice it involves everybody. And we need to use intersectionality to kind of have this holistic discussion and a holistic understanding of how power works and what we can do about it. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, that was, thank you to the folks.
Can I take the liberty of answering this question in the chat? What is the definition of white supremacy? Because I don't want to leave this group, and I know there's still over 80 of us here, so let's still, have us all at, on the same page on what white supremacy means. So in my work, Lois, I think that's your question. I define white supremacy as follows: that white supremacy is the social, political, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white. Social, political, and economic dominance of people socially defined as white. And all components of that definition for me are important, particularly the last part, right? People who are defined as white, because that gets at that, social and historical construction of race. These are made up ideas and categories, and who counts as white and what kind of white and the right kind of white or not. That is, we have a lot in the sort of the history of race and the history of whiteness that we can learn from. But what hasn't changed in our country's history is the association between whiteness and resources. And what kind of resources? Everything from citizenship itself, our country's very first law about who could naturalize as a citizen, the Naturalization Act of 1790. It was explicitly white supremacist. It said that only free white persons could naturalize as citizens of the United States. And that's just one, instantiation of this idea that this is a country for white people. It's not just white nationalists and neo-Nazis today who believe that was in many ways part of the founding ideology upon which our country was based. Of course, this was in critical tension with the idea that this was a country of freedom. And so people who have been fighting against white supremacy and slavery and other forms of oppression have also been, trying to create a new understanding of freedom that is above and beyond what we see embedded in some of the core ideas from some of our founders. So white supremacy is about power. It's not just about the KKK. I think that's one of the major misconceptions I try to address in my work and in my book. The belief that white supremacy just means that you're, an extremist. Of course, it includes white nationalists and Nazis, but it also is the system of power upon which our society was created. And so that means on the flip side, if we want to build a world of peace and justice, then we're going to have to change the distribution of resources. And that's not even just about racial justice, it's also about economic justice. And so that's the answer to that question. Someone asked, is Resurrecting Slavery published in French? Farida, not yet. I'm working on it. I'm in the process of finding a translator. The book came out in English in 2017. And I'd love, to finally get it out in French. Hopefully I'll have some news in that area relatively soon. But yes, we're working on it. And I lived in France for a few years, and so it would mean a lot to me to get that work to French audiences. So thank you for that question.
That's beautiful. I speak no French, but maybe I can learn reading your book. My mom speaks.
Well, the book's in English, so
all right.
No problem.
I'll start with the English. No, just kidding. We got the English down, but the French could be tight. Okay, I think I want to just say that is such an important thing to think about. It's just the fact, I think you kind of said white supremacy isn't really working for very many people. Maybe it's not working for anyone. And we can take these questions from kids sometimes. And a kid asked us what does racism work for anybody? And the video we put out in response was yeah, no, probably not. I mean, that's not to say that it affects everyone the same. Obviously, there are different ways that it affects all of us, but it's not really good for anyone. And so, the idea
it's economically good for elites, but it's not good for their humanity.
Yeah, not good for the soul.
It's not good for, right, because and this is something that Black activists and other, social justice activists have been explaining for years, and everyone from James Baldwin to Toni Morrison to Ida B. Wells, Du Bois, right? They're very clear that racist ideology attempts to dehumanize its targets, but in so doing, it definitely dehumanizes the people who succumb to these false beliefs of superiority that are built on lies and mythology and a false understanding of who we are as living beings and as humans. And I just want to say, I know we're out of time, but I think this is one of the most striking facts about race that is important to understand. Is just not, it's just baloney. It's not true. The ideology of race teaches us that if we look alike, we have the same skin tone, if we have the same kind of hair, if we think we're the same race, we're more genetically similar. We think we can look at people and infer, oh, we're more alike, or we're not alike. And what science has taught us is that it's actually the opposite. That in fact, there's more genetic similarity between people of different so-called races, these made-up ideas, than there is among so the whole ideology of difference and who is related to whom, race as an idea, it confuses us. It's a fundamental misunderstanding of who we are and what we are. And so when I talk about racial stupidity, I'm even talking about the stupidity in the idea of race itself. Right. But that doesn't mean that, we can magically solve racism by not talking about race. This is one of the problems they have in France, that they think, oh, well, race doesn't exist, so we don't have to have anti-racism law, or we don't have to, we shouldn't include race on the census to count people and measure disparities. Race is a made-up idea, but the realities of racism are real, and we have to grapple with them. And that unfortunately means still using these terms that are made up and harmful, so that we can get to a place where we all understand this is not who we really are, and this is not who we ever were as a species, that we are actually a human species. We're not, 10 different species based on what race you are. So we need to really get real about who and what we are as a species, as human beings, if we're going to have a future on this planet.
Yeah, I love that. I think because there's, an inclination to just be like, we need to get rid of race, but it's like, insofar as we still live in this society, we have to keep those terms. And we know that we're moving towards the truth, which is that we are, all interconnected, as you said, as we talk to our kids about at Mosaic, and that we are more similar than we are different, but we have to acknowledge the systems that exist right now in order to do that.
Exactly.
And the intersection of hope and hardship, like, the happy, the sad, all of it. Yeah. Crystal, thank you. Dr. Fleming, excuse me. I won't just call you by your first
Please call me Crystal.
No, let me say Dr. Fleming for all these people. Dr. Fleming, thank you so much. I was just honored to be in your presence today, and I think a lot of folks feel that way. For folks who I didn't get to your questions, I'm so sorry. Please, stay in touch, and we'll try to do the best that we can in getting information out to you. But thank you all so much for being here. I hope you all enjoyed yourselves as much as I did. And Dr. Fleming, just again, greatest gratitude.
Thank you so much. I know there were a ton more questions. Sorry, we can't get to all of them now, but if you'd like to connect with me, feel free to visit my website, crystalfleming.com, and send me an email or connect with me on social media if you'd like to stay engaged.
Amazing. And people are thanking me in the chat too. I don't know if you know, but yeah, they're thanking you. They're saying you're amazing. Oh, and everyone's thanking you. Yeah. Farewell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.